Okay.
Yes, well, would you like an introduction, or can we just go straight in?
I'll introduce myself. It's fine. I'm fine. I think everybody knows who knows me, knows my name. Whether they know who I am is actually different. And I think listening to the previous people who've introduced themselves, I think probably my family history is really quite different. And I think I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about my parents, because I think it places me and some of my Michigas very firmly in where I come from. My father was born in 1914. His mother came from a place called Sachwala outside Bialystok, and they were cabinet makers, and their name was Steele. And why is this, or the name they used when they got to England was Steele? Why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because actually having 1980 something, sitting in Hilary Leake's playroom, I happened to ask her what her maiden name was. And she announced it was Steele, and they were cabinet makers from Bialystok. And we took a fairly distant relation, actually related to Chaim Lieb, the milkman, more of him later. She took this family tree and took it to her father's 80th birthday. Her aunt looked at it and said, "Yes, we're related. That Chaim Lieb, the milkman, his family left for South Africa, and they left owing us 10 shillings. If you put her father and my father next to each other, however close or not close they were related, and I think we're probably third cousins 3 times removed or something. We've just enjoyed this story. They were like 2 peas in a pod. And quite often when I see Andrew Leake standing, from the back, I think it's my son Ben. So it's really interesting how mishpachology works. My grandmother, Sarah, married somebody way back in 1890 or 1898, something like that. She had 1 child, and then he died, and she remarried a man called Mordechai Zev. Young women with, capable of working with a child were always put with somebody just to get them out of the family, and 2, to keep whatever man it was where he should be. And we never knew about this first husband until the story was told by one of my cousins that his father had lined up to join up in 1914. And his mother had ran down the road with his birth certificate saying, "He can't join up. He's only 18, he's only 16 or whatever it was." And he then discovered that the person he thought was his father wasn't his father. But Mordechai Zev was a very violent man, a very man who purported to be religious but wasn't. He had an outdoor working tailoring shop, as it were, with all his children working for him and with him. My father remembers being very small, wheeling a wheelbarrow full of clothes down the Whitechapel Road and being given a farthing for delivering the goods to this other man. This other man, the boss, told his father how good little Barney had been, and he'd given him a farthing. And Mordechai Zev gave him a good beating for not giving his father the farthing. He and his brother used to like walking down and listening to different chazanim in Whitechapel Road, going in and out of all the different shuls. One Shabbos, his father gets off the bus drunk, and then beats his son there and then for not being in shul on Shabbos. You can see why my father never really wanted to be in shul and was very reluctant for anything like that at all. His mother died when he was 13. He remembers another thing, which I think is fascinating and great for the children. He was sent out to get straw to put on the floor because you laid a dead body on the floor. Quite why, I don't know, but it's an interesting an interesting Hamish sort of tradition. He had his bar mitzvah, and then with a raging fever and hugely infected tonsils, took himself into Whitechapel Hospital, London Hospital, had his tonsils removed there and then, was befriended by one of the doctors who was a member of St. John's Ambulance, which is a voluntary first aid place, and naturally never went back home. He went to stay with his brother-in-law, who made sure that this 13-year-old could use the sewing machine and could get a job. And as soon as he had a job, which was paid, he then went and lived on his own, and with his 13 and 6 a week, paid for the one room. When he was hungry, he went to this Chaim Lieb, who was his uncle on the other side of the family, who was a milkman. According to Hilary's family, he watered his milk, because don't forget, it wasn't in bottles. And he got given on a Thursday night, he got given 2 slices of bread and a slice of Gouda cheese, and was taken home on the donkey, not the donkey, the milk float. He got taken back on his milk float. He joined a cycling club, became very, very left-wing, was a communist cycling club. So you can tell where some of my roots are from that. My mother had a slightly different history. Their family came from Kalish, which was Galicia, which was actually very, very close to where Rabbi Willie Wolf was actually born and came. Their family were fishermen. Putting all the things together that we could, we reckon that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, was a people smuggler. He got Jews up through the river on the boats, and as the family ended up in Paris. And their first child was born in 1895 in Paris. And so Akiva, as he became known as Kenneth afterwards, was bilingual. And that stood the family in very good stead, because he was able to get a teaching degree, and ended up teaching at a boys' grammar school in London. So the rest of the family didn't do quite so well, but they expected him to obviously do what all families that get one child well educated, is to look after everybody else. So my mother was the 12th or 13th child in the family. I didn't believe that until I saw the census, when I saw my grandmother had had so many live births. It actually tells you on the census. That was the 1911 census, and then my mother and her twin sister were born in 1915. The little rats, my mother was put in a cardboard box filled with cotton wool, and she survived, but her twin died in Great Ormond Street Hospital fairly soon. She was therefore the spoilt one, but they had a sweet shop in Dalston. My mother, even at 7 or 8, was delivering the papers, hiding down away from the school board man, because even then children of 7 and 8 didn't deliver papers. And her parents, very from. Lovely side story, when my mother was in Nightingale, she met somebody, a woman called Sarah, who was quite a bit older than her, who remembered her parents, remembered the shop, and remembered how they all had the same stiebel together, and how they all the people from there all met up again in their family groups, And her parents died in 1925, within 3 or 4 months of each other. So Mum, at 10, went to live with her oldest brother, who by that time was 30. She was very much a skivvy, I think. She had to babysit her nephew, who was 7 years younger than her, and didn't have a particularly good life. I've got a picture of her in an interesting looking coat, and I said, that's a lovely, it's interesting, you've got a nice winter coat there. She said, yes, Ken made it for me out of a blanket. This is what poor families did, obviously, but So she ended up as a felling. She did do a shorthand typing, but she ended up as a felling hand, doing the bases of coats and things in a factory. And one day she went down to give a farthing to the organ grinder who had a monkey with him. And she looked at the man calling out of the window, "What are you giving that horrible, why are you paying for that horrible music?" She looked up and a pigeon proceeded to deposit something in her eye. The man, of course, came down to give her his handkerchief to wipe it off. And that was my father, and they were married in 1936. It's a lovely story, isn't it? Pigeons are supposed to bring you good luck. What happened during the war is not really my story, but it does give you a sense of how making do the best you can, and the fact that you might be dirt poor, that they weren't quite as poor as some other people. My mother remembers going to see somebody in the East End, and they were so poor they didn't even have lino on their floor. So they were a little bit better than having, they did have lino. In about 1945, my mother found a flat upstairs, a house. She was a sitting tenant. After the war, there was a huge housing shortage because of the bombing in London, and she felt herself very fortunate to find this 2-bedroom flat after my father was demobbed. He, by the way, was one of those people who went across at Arnhem to bring back people. And it always reminds me of, because he was a medical orderly, having been St. John's Ambulance. One of those people wasn't, because he died there, Helen Barnett's brother, who actually died at Arnhem. Sort of really interesting link there. So there we were, very happily in this house. We had half the garden. I was born in 1947, and the elderly gentleman who owned the house sold the house with what was called without vacant possession. If you're talking about anti-Semitism, the next thing was that Mr. and Mrs. Brown would like to have the whole of the house. So they did, as my mother always said, the phrase was, they did everything to get us out, including pushing, shoving, and attacking my father, who, there was a court case where there was a restraining order put on him, Mr. Brown, that is, not my father. And one of my earliest memories is being taken out of the court where the court, whatever the proceedings were going on, screaming by my aunt whilst this was going on. They eventually, in the attempts to terrorize us, I suppose, had bought a dog who was set out every morning to try and get my father as he went to work. And he took to carrying a pepper pot so that he could throw that at the dog and get rid of him that way. We go back to Uncle Dave, who had given Dad the wherewithal to get a job. He, by this time, is managing a factory in Raynham. This is all ladies' tailoring, by the way, in case you hadn't realized. And he, having made some money, was able to lend us the money to put a deposit down on a house. And the story always then was when we got out of there. It was just such a relief. We only moved 2 turnings away in Leytonstone, but it was a big, even at 6 or 7 when this happened, I can remember the feeling of relief to be out of the house. I went to the local Federation Synagogue Cheder because my uncle, who brought my mother up, had insisted that I should go to Cheder. I think because he was a founder member of the shul, I was welcomed. My father, when they moved, I didn't go to Cheder anymore. I think my father quite happily said, no more, no more. His view of religion was not the best. Dad was always working in the tailoring on what they called short time. He was sort of had periods of time out of work. And my mother then decided that she would recall all the typing skills that she'd learned when she was 15 and went back to work. Not that she hadn't been working in the house or anything. This made me a latchkey child, so I became very self-sufficient, even stamping out the flames when I was lighting the fire. You know how you used to light the fire and put paper across the fire to help it draw? Well, I caught it one time, I must have been about 10 or 11, it caught a light. I dropped it down, and as far as I can remember, I actually managed to clean it all up, and I don't know whether my mother ever knew. But it was a refining experience, let's put it this way. My cousin, the one that my mother had helped bring up, became a teacher as well, and he coached me for my 11 plus, which was great because I got to grammar school. Everybody's wish, you know, that your child would pass their 11 plus, but there was no real help once I got there because my parents, having left school at 13 and 14, had no idea what they should be doing helping. By the way, I think most of you know quite the tales of my dyslexia. It was particularly bad in Hebrew, but it wasn't very helpful at school when you didn't know how to arrange yourself or arrange your work. However, I did get a job in Woolworths on a Saturday morning, and I earned, I think it was 11 and 9p plus lunch, or I got 11 and 9p after I had lunch. But it's a whole day. And one day a friend, actually a person I'm still friendly with, we were brought up in the same road, who told me how nice the Brown family were, by the way, that she'd become friendly with their boys. They'd obviously had a second child after we'd moved out. We walked up the length of Oxford Street because at that time, Oxford Street only was open on a Saturday morning. It was their half-day closing, surprisingly, now when you think back. And I got a job in Wallace shops on a Saturday. And it was a whole coterie of very down-to-earth Jewish women there who sort of became like a second family. It was a lovely atmosphere. I was very much the youngster there, but I learned how to do the books and had jobs when I went to teach training college there. It was great. And I also learned how to sell, which was very, not just coats and suits and things, but very great shame that Wallace has shut down now. All my friends at school were not Jewish. It wasn't a very Jewish area. And I discovered, my mother discovered that I was the only place I was going to was a youth club, but the youth club was in the local Methodist church. She didn't like this and quickly found that there was a Maccabi nearby, another Jewish youth group. It wasn't particularly sporty, though I realize now that Maccabi was very much based on sports. And they had a competition, which I think was one of the things that changed my life. The competition was you could write a story about an essay about why you wanted to go to Israel, and they would pay for you to join the Maccabi trip to Israel. So I wrote, and I think I've still got it somewhere, that, if you're a member of Maccabi, like Yehuda Halevi said in the 13th century, I got hold of my father's book of thoughts for Jewish servicemen. Somebody else said they had one of them. I sort of said, it's said by Yehuda Halevi that Israel is the heart of mankind and that you would get, and so I threw in 3 or 4 phrases of Jewish knowledge, which I didn't have at the time, but it was useful. And I won the trip, which was rather lovely. And it was fascinating, fantastic, that feeling of getting off that plane. We stopped in Rome, and then we came on the heat and the fact that this was, I can't explain it, but it was wonderful. When I finished that, I was then in the 6th form, and this was the year of the Great Train Robbery, because I remember hearing about it in Israel. A girl who was a year above me in the Jewish assembly, which we had to have, suggested that we didn't bother with this, but we joined FZY. This was, far nicer. We'd have talks about Israel and the rest of it. And it'd be nice if we went together. And I'm still in touch with one of the people. His mother turned up at Nightingale as well, and we're still friends on Facebook. And he said, "You weren't actually old enough for FZY. You should have gone to Huff and Jump, but we were very low on numbers of the girls, so we let you in." And through the Federation of Zionist Youth, I really did learn a tremendous amount. I remember some of it entirely inaccurate now when I think about it, about the stories about the United Nations camps and so on, but that's another part of it. And through the FZY, I was only just over 16 at the time I met Jeff, who was known as Howard Jeff Mason, but he was always called Jeff. And then one day I went to visit him at home, and he opened the door and said, "I have to tell you, I'm called Howard at home." But Howard wasn't a very suitable name for somebody who wanted to work in a wimpy bar on Saturdays and things. So, and he was at St. Paul's School, by the way, so it was a very different thing. Interestingly, though, his parents and my parents, their histories mirrored themselves very much. So 65 to 68, I scraped, and I use the word scraped, into a teacher training college in Liverpool. This was on the background of the Six-Day War, where Jeff actually went as a madrachim, taking people across to help pick oranges, I think it was at the time. 68 to 69, I was a teacher in East Ham, really identified with the children who, you know, one of them telling me that it was great fun last night. They went to sleep by candlelight. Money had run out to buy, to light the house. I really identified with them, not so much from my history, where I'd always had enough to eat, even though I was worried about where the next meal but one was coming from. Got married in 69. Jeff had just come, had done a year Machon, which was the youth leadership from abroad. And so therefore he was still at Keele University. So I had a year teaching in Stoke-on-Trent, which again was quite an eye-opener, with my £5 a week in my purse as the housekeeping, and his great delight at being kept, because he was obviously at university and I was the one bringing the money in, which was, I've never let him forget that. And then in 1970, we moved to Rochdale, and he got a job with ICI, the ICI, and bought a house there. Interestingly, there, we really seriously contemplated whether we'd make Aliyah, and decided that we weren't going to have the same sort of life. When I became pregnant anyway with Ruth in 73, and that really rather scotched the idea. Joined the Labour Party. He became a Labour councillor, chair of the Trades and Labour Council. I did my stint of door knocking with Ruth in a pram. We remember we were shipped off somewhere, I don't quite know where it was, somewhere in South Manchester, where we did canvassing for Greville Janner. So when we came to London in 75 and we tried to carry on, the people were very, very much in Barnes, not the most down-to-earth people, and we'd sort of drifted away and didn't find it a home at all. But that sort of 70s Labour Party is still very much a bit where I'm rooted, I think. 73 Ruth, 74 Gabby, 77 David, and 78 Benjamin. So my four were born in less than 5 years. So for the next period of time, I was baby and toddler group. My parents-in-law were in Chiswick, which is why we chose to live in Barnes. It was just far enough away that they'd have to phone before they visited, but close enough. They enjoyed ill health even then, so we knew that they were going to be our responsibility, both Jeff and I being only children. 78, we did a shul crawl, decided that we weren't really going to go back to the Federation. Jeff didn't have good memories of Reverend Vennett, who was the Brook Green rabbi who taught him when he was at St. Paul's, and had a look at Kingston Liberal, which was too liberal. You know, it's a little bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I encountered Hillel Avidan in Wimbledon on a Friday night with the new, at the time, prayer book. And it was just right. He did a baby blessing for Ben and various other things. I'm going to digress a bit because I think it's an important part of me. In 1980, we had a huge fire in our house. And this, I think, has been something that has laid down some things for my life. I did most of this because at this time, Jeff was building his career as a management consultant with, at that time, he'd moved to Shell. And I took the brunt of it. And one of the things he did have was a budget. And so I got a day with one of his consultants who was a counselor. And I had a whole day just to discard, talk about, get rid of, cry, scream, whatever you like to call it, about what had happened in the fire, how lucky we were. It was Simchat Torah, by the way, how lucky we were not to have been there, and so on and so on. And this man was a counsellor, but he was also part of an organisation called Reevaluation Co-Counselling, which is a peer counselling group. And that's probably sustained me now from all the ups and downs, big and small, for the rest of my time. They're people who we train each other. It's a one-to-one, we don't charge each other. It's not official, but what it is a person who is not like you, friends who might gossip. It's not family who might take it on board. It's just somebody who you can unload your fears to, who will listen. I think that's the point. Nothing traumatic, nothing dramatic, just, and also I've met up with a number of other Jewish women and Jewish people through that, where we can look at the different things of the effects of the Holocaust on us, or our other attitudes. So it's been really one of the backbones that's just run through my life. Happy to talk about it a little bit more. It's always been quite difficult. It sounds as if there's something wrong with me, which is not the case. It's kept me right, as it were. Then there are two strands really after that. 1982, I started a TOPS course, which was a way of retraining people who weren't needed, like teachers. And I did shorthand and typing, and Jeff decided he'd go independent. And I slowly realized that his management consultancy, my ability to teach at that time, was really useful. And I ended up as a trainer, treating interview skills, equal opportunities, disability awareness, and a lovely one called Women into Management, which was great fun. Did it with a woman from West London Synagogue, actually. And that went on till about 98, when, following his family tradition, we stopped the business, sold the large house in Barnes, and moved to a much smaller house, also in Barnes. He also, if anybody's curious, is probably getting to know you, he decided to do another degree and ended up doing an Erasmus year in France. So he bought a house there. My life, of course, continued here. His life has continued there. I think we could say that we're still very supportive of each other in many ways. You know, there's nobody else you can talk to when your daughter, her first child, has Down syndrome. People else might say, that's a shame or whatever, but there's somebody who really, so we've done very well, and also very well, I think, for the children and the grandchildren, that they don't have to worry about whether it's mum, you know, whether they're going to have grandma or grandpa over because they're not talking. I think partly that's due to the fact that he's in France and is now marooned there, of course. I said to people I'd talk about going to the Western Wall. the reevaluation counselling people sent me there to a women's conference, just as an observer and to meet with other people in Israel who were also co-counsellors. And at that stage, we, a number of people, Blue Greenberg, if anybody has heard of Yitz Greenberg, was one of the women there. Her book, I can't recommend her books, they're super. So we all went to the Western Wall to read Torah that Shabbat. And was it a Thursday? It doesn't really matter. What happened was they threw chairs at us, they screamed at us, they did everything they can. It was the first time, I think, that women had actually taken a Sefer Torah to the wall. And I got a picture of me on the back page of the Times, which I can't find at the moment, which is infuriating. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but I'm proud I did it. And I think we all had the right to. Okay, let's move back to the shul very quickly. I've spoken for more than half an hour already. We joined, as I said, in 78. I became part of the PTA. I did the creche for the High Holy Days for many, many years. Danny Smith was very, very keen on people attending with their children when they were B'nai Mitzvah. And so I became a regular. Right, let's just go back a bit. The fact was that this Jewish background of mine was very Jewish, but not very knowledgeable. And so we started to go to Limud from the second Limud. And I think a huge amount of my Jewish education was the next 13 years at Limud and Melton and other things that were happening. I took every opportunity I could, despite 4 children and a full-time job, to try and learn a lot more than it seemed to me that if I've got Jewish children, they might as well know what it was to be Jewish and make the decision as to whether or not they wish to continue this, rather than have all the anti-Semitism thrown at them and not know what it was about or how to be proud of what they were. Yeah, and unfortunately, one of my children has made the decision not to continue to be Jewish. It's been hard. He's now a Mormon, but he's got the most wonderful wife, 3 brilliant children, and a 4th soon to be adopted. But, you know, he has had his choice, and I feel no regrets of what a background I gave him. There's many reasons why he made that choice. So I became a warden. I became honorary secretary after that. I was on council. I helped with I became co-chair of the Ladies Guild with Ziggy Quick. They loved me because I was one of the youngest people there. And of course I could go because I was working from home, and I could bring Ben along with me as well. I was senior warden. 86 again, Ruth was bat mitzvah. All the parents of all her friends from RSY came to the house to pick her up. Somebody discovered that Jeff and I were management trainers, consultants. Jeff found himself as chair of the Youth Development Committee for RSY. I found myself doing training of how to run meetings and various other things for the reform movement, which was then, as I say, RSGB. This morphed after a great deal of time, actually, into me becoming vice chair of the movement. And the next person to be vice chair of the movement, by the way, was a woman called Jenny Pizer, who then became chair, and she is also my son's mother-in-law. So it was a little bit incestuous. 94, I think it was, I became chair. We appointed Bob Shafritz. I became chair after Bob became our rabbi. And I think that was one of the most traumatic times for us. And again, was able to dump a lot of this mishigas with the counselling and was able to keep a clear mind, because Bob died that suddenly in July 96, after he'd seen Queensmere Road and had thought what a wonderful shul it would be. And so he was the kindest, nicest man you could imagine, and a little bit like Rabbi Willie Wolf, very, very difficult to be the manager of. But much loved by many people. The move was great. I mean, the people who helped and the way it worked and the reaction of our removal people even was amazing, because of course there was plenty of sandwiches and cups of tea and so on for everybody. My sort of life carried on, really. I stepped down from being chair in the 2000s. As I say, Jeff and I separated and finally divorced. Our children married, I had grandchildren. My parents moved from where they were retired in Eastbourne to Nightingale. Then it was decided to refurbish the synagogue. Quite a bit of the rest of that is losh, but let me say that I came back onto synagogue council in order to try to make sure that people were consulted, that people felt that they were part of the synagogue and part of the refurbishment, and they knew that they'd had a say in where their money was going. And I think we pulled it back. I stayed on council, and as you probably remember from the near past, was persuaded to be co-chair with Patrick, and of course now senior warden. And it's really interesting, when you asked me about to do this, I sort of realized how much my life was sort of compartmentalized, really. I was a teacher, I was a management trainer, and a B&B proprietor. When Jeff left to France, living in France, of course, I had a 4-bedroomed house with only me in it. And again, back to my early roots, a need to make sure that I had an income. So I got a B&B going, and actually by 2019 was very successful. It was well regarded, apart from anything else. TripAdvisor loved me, and so on. But of course, I've not done anything like that since last February, and don't know whether I will do anything in the future. I became a volunteer at Nightingale when my mother and father were both in the sheltered accommodation, and their mum moved into Nightingale. And one of the great things I did there is partly family history again, the love of Italian opera. I still will do as in the future, did sessions of opera for various different floors, various different homes. And I'm also on one of the committees there, which looks at the way in which the non-medical treatment, we're sort of evaluators of the non-medical treatment, the way people are cared for, where their activities and so on. So I'm one of the auditors for that. As an only child, I think the other thing with me was family. Only child, looking after my parents. I didn't actually have to do any physical caring, but I was very much part of that. Marriage, we had a very successful marriage for 30 years and a successful divorce for the past 20. As you probably know, Jeff's still a member. Parent, 4 children. And I've really no grumbles. They've all got good jobs. They've all got lovely partners. And of course, I've got 11, soon to be 12 grandchildren.
Wow.
David's in the process of adopting his 4th child. They couldn't have another one. Shul has always been a place for me, as much as a place where I wanted my children to learn and feel proud. And it's really satisfied that. I don't think, I think even more so during lockdown, when Friday nights and Saturday mornings have just become that regular, not even having to think twice about whether or not you go out into the cold or something, has been very special. My relationships with, should have switched this off, shouldn't I? That's Rachel Ousley, by the way. And I think the other strand for me has been, since separated, various friends, some of them from my baby and toddler group in 1978, and some of whom from grammar school and even earlier with Janet, who our parents knew each other when we were first born, as I did with Lynn, parents meeting at their baby and toddler groups. And in fact, in the line for seeing the gynecologist, traveling with them, Spain, France, Cambodia, India, Costa Rica, various other places. It's been lovely that being able to do that. Still loving the operas when I can get there. I do that solo. If I can get to Covent Garden on my own, I do. I've got my favorite seat up in the gods. And then I've got a nice group of women friends who we meet up every so often. My house being the biggest, they meet with me and we have supper together and just chew the fat and realize that there are other people in the same position as us. So it's a good life and it's been an interesting one.
Stella, that was lovely. Thank you so much. You're finishing on such a lovely upbeat note, and it's been great. I've been sort of thinking about when you start off with very little money, everybody in the family, and it's quite a struggle, and you went on an upward curve, so upward line all the way through it. Seems.
Yeah, I think the point I'd like to make there was one of the reasons why I wanted to put it that way. Not all Jews are rich, and I think the outer world particularly has that myth that all Jews are rich. Yes. And even right down to when I was on the board of the Reform movement and they wanted £70 to go to a dinner. And I said, I understand that we're fundraising, but what about the feelings of the people who'd like to support, but whom £70 would be far too much, and 140 if there are two of them. Yeah. And I think that's...
I felt very much the same way, Stella, about that, about the £70, because I'm from a poor background too, and you never forget what it's like to...
Yeah, it really informs you.
Yes.
If people would like to ask questions, Stella, you're okay to stay on for a bit, Stella. Please don't forget to unmute yourselves because you've probably all been muted. So before you start, just unmute. Anybody wants to come in?
Yeah. Stella, although you were an only child, but your parents were from large families.
Yeah.
So you have this huge network of family.
No, I don't, because my parents were both the youngest of their families.
Okay.
So I have cousins who, if they were alive today, would be into their 90s and their 100s. And my mother's brothers and sisters were all dead by the time I was 10 or 11. I remember visiting them, but because there was that huge age gap.
Sure. What about their children, though?
Families like that dissipate. I see occasionally the wife of one of my cousins on various websites when we're looking at the Wellspring project, for example, which is the project to bring a mikveh to North London, an egalitarian mikveh, and Merle turns up on that. But that's really, my cousin, 7-8 years older than me, she'd be 81, 82. We just lost contact, particularly as I moved to West London, and they were all very much based in the East End. I'm in touch with one of Jeff's cousins, but very few, but mind you, when we all get together as a family, there are 22 of us, so it doesn't really matter.
What do you want to do?
I found it interesting, Stella, that when you were, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
I found it interesting that when you were doing your shul crawl in your younger days, that you came down south. Did you not crawl the other way?
No, because living in Barnes, Hammersmith Bridge was always a bit of a barrier. I mean, it is a complete barrier now because it's closed both to foot and whatchamacallit traffic. No, it never, as I say, we went to Shepherd's Bush, to Brook Green, and then up the Shepherd's Bush back to the one where Jeff was brought up, which was a little Federation synagogue in Poplar Grove. And we would have been the youngest by about 30, 40, 50 years if we'd gone there. Jeff didn't want to really go back to Reverend Vennett, who was, as I say, one of his teachers, who was the rabbi at St. Paul's. So, plus...
Yeah, interestingly, Reverend Vennett, my grandparents were members of Brook Green Shul, and interestingly, Reverend Vennett taught our elder son his bar mitzvah at St. Paul's, and actually it was a beautiful synagogue.
Oh,
it was almost a replica of the New West End Synagogue in Bayswater.
That's where I was married.
It's a church now.
Yes, I was married in the New West End, and Jeff had his bar mitzvah party and was bar mitzvah in Brook Green. So, you know, very much part of that. Yes. So it's quite, you know, the move, it proved really useful, because one of the other traumatic things that happens was that Jeff's parents in 1988 died within 12 weeks of each other, which was quite a hard thing. I do remember, and I think this is one of the things that brings us back to why did we choose Wimbledon. When we went to the Shiva for my father-in-law, the young man who'd been a student who was given a home in the flat above Poplar Grove Shul did the Shiva. And he said, if I'd have known Mr. Mason, I've told Mr. Mason was a wonderful man, but I never met him. I never saw Mr. Mason in Shul. And I had to go up to him and say, well, Mr. Mason didn't see you because he was in hospital for the last 12 months of his life. And he was a wonderful man. He turned up every week to make up the minyan, even if he really himself didn't want to be there. He did it for the other people. I think that perhaps you ought to know that. And then when my mother-in-law died, Danny Smith then we had this Shiva, another Shiva at our house for the reform movement, as it were. Danny Smith spent about 5 minutes, I can see him now, sitting on the arm of my mother-in-law's chair, talking to her. And he gave the most wonderful hesped after just that sort of 5 minutes talk, which gave us the essence of Jack, and so respectful. He never admitted to know. He said I'd only seen him at his granddaughter's bat mitzvahs, but I could see how fond he was of them, and then proceeded to say what else that Rini had told him. And you can tell the difference there was just, you know, and I do hear that, you know, we do get a lot of members from funerals, as it may seem strange as it may seem. But yes, Brook Green was, that's also, I think, I think it's a Seventh-day Adventist, the one at Poplar Grove. Yeah.
There was a very big Jewish population in that area, in Brook Green, Hammersmith.
Yes, yes.
In those days.
Pardon? Somebody was a butcher.
There used to be a kosher butcher in the Shepherd's Bush Road, just round the corner from Brook Green. I remember going there with my mother.
Yeah.
There was also a grocer, a Jewish grocer, Ashken's.
Ashken's, yes.
And I remember we were quite shocked when smoked salmon became £1 a pound at the time. But there you are.
Yes. I remember walking home from there, Yom Kippur, to Jeff's parents' house, quite a long way. Yes. They live with his. And I mean, life goes funny. His grandfather, who lived with them, had 2 fish and chip shops which he'd kept open during the war. So had actually managed to amass a little money from putting himself in quite a great deal of danger. And they were in Leytonstone High Road, Leyton and Leytonstone, which of course was where I was, but we never met them. But it was quite interesting to have the sort of family connections. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know how you managed to put everything together in so many jobs and 4 children. That's beyond me.
Well, 4 children. Life was very different, I think, when I had the 4 children in the 80s, because having them so close together and the rest of it, we could afford an au pair. I mean, we paid this young woman £9 a week. And that meant that some of the weight and the ability to go to work was the fact that there was somebody who was there. Because I was working freelance, it was somebody who I knew consistently was there. Didn't always work out. Ben walked himself around the corner to a friend's house one day, and their au pair was going to put them on the bus to go to East Sheen Primary School, where I live opposite now, with the 33 bus, and he slipped, but he slipped in front of a passing car. And I got phoned at work. He actually didn't really badly hurt himself, but it was quite something. That's why you see I'm Stella Soli. When I worked, I was Stella Soli, so that it didn't seem too incestuous that Jeff was there as well, perhaps running the same course as me. So it didn't always work out. I've never been allowed to forget that one, as you can imagine. My parents were wonderful with that. I mean, Ben had an appendix out, very fortunately, on a Friday before a bank holiday weekend. And then we had the bank holiday Monday, and then my father came up and took him back to Eastbourne to recuperate. I did have that, being an only child again. They only had one daughter to help and one set of grandchildren. I find it a lot more difficult now, not that I've seen any of them for the past 3-4 months, which is very hard. I do have one daughter who's a member of the synagogue, Gabby Moss, who was her daughter was the first child to be bat mitzvah on Zoom. That was way back last May. Ruth's a member of South Bucks Liberal, and there's just a fight going on. I'm delighted to say there's a fight going on as to whether the children will go to Kadima or Shemesh, and those 2 families. Yes, and then Ben is a member of Aleph and is one of their security people, because he did make Aliyah and came back with a view to learning the pub trade, actually, because he was going to go back after the army. To friends of his were going to bankroll him to start a chain of pubs in Israel. However, he did actually. He did 2 years. Yes, simultaneously, I had every Jewish mother's nightmare with a son in the army, and every Jewish mother's dream with my daughter marrying a Jewish doctor. So anyway, they did go back in the end, he and Ilana, who was Maskira of RSY Netza, and he became the security manager for the British Embassy. And he'd also done the security for the Sternberg Centre, because and he'd learned all of that sort of stuff from doing the pub trade. It was very long and winded, but he's now the security manager for an American bank. Well, he's not the manager, he's the vice president. So, interestingly, not getting a job in Israel was actually quite useful to him.
Good.
Yeah. So anyway, supposed to be an hour.
Do we have any more questions, or shall we say thank you very much, Stella?
Great, Stella.
Thank you. Very interesting. Very enjoyable.
Thank you so much for your hard work in it. Lovely.
Thank you.
Anyway.
So
thank you, Stella.
It was fun, and it'll be even more fun if I can get the YouTube to give to my family.
Oh.
It will no doubt correct me where I've got things wrong.
Well, it says live on YouTube, so we're all right.
Yes.
Okay, so